On a sunny afternoon in the small town of Greenfield, Alex made his usual stop at the local cafe. It was a peaceful place where everyone knew everyone, and the chatter was always light and comforting. The town was a typical slice of Americana, where folks went about their days with familiar routines, friendly faces, and the occasional political debate that never went too far. But today, as Alex walked in wearing his MAGA hat, something in the air seemed different. It was subtle at first, just a quiet murmur when he entered, an awkward glance shared among a few regulars. But it didn't take long for the tension to build. Alex wasn't a particularly loud or outspoken man. He had moved to Greenfield a few years ago, hoping to escape the fast pace of city life. He was a simple man, content with his small construction business and a few close friends. Politics weren't something he ever brought up at the coffee shop. He was just there to enjoy his drink and escape the noise of the world outside. But today, things felt off. He could sense it as he made his way to the counter. "Hey, Alex," greeted Joe, the barista, though his smile seemed a little forced. "Hey, Joe," Alex replied, taking a seat at the counter. He noticed a woman sitting at the other end of the bar, her eyes fixed on him. She had a mohawk, bright, almost fluorescent, a sharp contrast against the otherwise dull decor of the cafe. Alex wasn't one to judge someone based on their appearance, but he could feel the weight of her stare. He tried to ignore it, ordering his usual, black coffee, nothing fancy. As he waited for his drink, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woman with the mohawk had now stood up and was slowly walking towards him. He turned his head, trying to meet her eyes with a friendly smile, but instead of returning the greeting, she scowled and crossed her arms. There was a strange, almost hostile energy coming from her. Alex had always prided himself on staying calm and composed, but today, something about her demeanor unsettled him. "You're one of them," she said, her voice loud enough for those around them to hear. Alex blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" She didn't flinch. "You know, people like you who wear those hats. You think it's all just a joke, but it's not. You're spreading hate, ignorance, and division. Don't you feel ashamed?" Her words came at him in rapid-fire succession, like bullets from a gun. The cafe fell silent. Alex could feel every pair of eyes in the room shift towards them. Some of the regulars glanced nervously at each other, unsure of how to react, while others remained fixated on the escalating confrontation. Alex tried to remain calm. He wasn't one for arguing, especially not in public. He didn't wear the MAGA hat to provoke anyone, but to him, it was just a symbol of his support for the country and its leadership. He wasn't looking to make a statement or start a fight. "Look, I'm just here for a coffee," Alex said, trying to defuse the situation with a shrug. "I didn't come here to start anything." But the woman wasn't listening. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she continued, her voice growing louder. "People like you think it's just a joke, like your actions don't have consequences. You're supporting a man who stands for everything that's wrong with this country." At this point, a few heads began to turn away, uncomfortable with the rising tension, but no one intervened. Joe, the barista, seemed frozen behind the counter, unsure of what to do. Alex could feel the weight of every single person's gaze on him now. His hands tightened around the cup he hadn't even touched yet. He'd had enough of these kinds of conversations online, but he never expected them to follow him into his peaceful refuge. "I'm not here to argue about politics," Alex said, his voice steady but firm. "I just want to enjoy my coffee in peace." The woman snorted. "Enjoy your peace while you can," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "People like you are destroying this country. You're just too blind to see it." Alex's heart raced. He could feel his blood start to boil. This wasn't the time or place for this, and yet, it seemed like she was forcing him into a corner. The whole cafe was watching, and he knew that if he didn't respond, he'd look weak. But he also knew that if he retaliated, things would escalate quickly, and he didn't want that. Still, he couldn't let her keep attacking him, not without saying something. "I'm not destroying anything," Alex said, his voice now raised, but controlled. "I just believe in doing what's best for the country, same as you, I bet. We might disagree on how to get there, but that doesn't mean we can't respect each other." The woman's face turned red with anger. "Respect? You're the one who doesn't respect anyone. You wear that hat like it's some kind of badge of honor, like you're proud of the hate it represents." Alex shook his head. "You're wrong," he said softly. "I wear this hat because I believe in change, in something better. Maybe it's not the change you want, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." But the woman wasn't listening. "You know what? I've had enough of people like you." With that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor as she went. The door swung open behind her, and the room returned to an eerie silence. Alex sat there for a moment, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Joe, finally breaking his silence, looked at Alex apologetically. "I'm sorry about that, man. People get a little heated these days." Alex nodded, still trying to calm his nerves. "It's fine. I didn't expect that to happen, but I guess some people just want to pick a fight." He sighed, feeling the weight of the confrontation settle on his chest. The rest of the cafe returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere had shifted. People still whispered in hushed tones, glancing over at Alex as if wondering what he'd do next. It wasn't just the woman with the mohawk who had been affected by the encounter, the entire town seemed to be reeling from it. As Alex left the cafe, he felt a strange mixture of frustration and unease. He had been in disagreements before, but nothing like this. The woman's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. It wasn't just about the MAGA hat. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. Why had it escalated so quickly? Why had she reacted that way? He tried to shake off the feeling, but it stayed with him throughout the day. As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't help but notice the stares of a few people as they passed by. He knew that people in Greenfield were divided, but now it felt different. He couldn't escape the feeling that this incident was just the beginning. Something was brewing in this town, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time, and today, it had finally boiled over. In the days that followed, Alex's life would begin to change in ways he never expected. The woman with the mohawk had made a choice to confront him, but it was his decision on how to respond that would determine the course of everything to come. The town of Greenfield would never be the same, and neither would Alex. The days following the confrontation at the cafe were filled with a kind of eerie tension that Alex hadn't experienced before. Greenfield, a town where he had once felt like a quiet, unassuming part of the community, now seemed to be watching him from the sidelines. There was a palpable change in the air, like the first signs of a storm on the horizon, but with no clear idea of when or how it would hit. Alex had hoped that the incident with the woman would blow over. After all, people like her were bound to make waves now and then, right? But this wasn't just a random outburst. The way she had approached him, the venom in her words, and the way she had singled him out, it wasn't just about a disagreement over politics. It felt personal. He had barely been home for an hour before his phone started buzzing with messages. The first one was from his old friend, Carl. "Hey, man, you good? I heard some stuff went down at the cafe with you and that woman. Everyone's talking about it. Are you alright?" Alex ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the world press down on him. He didn't want to get into it. He wasn't one to gossip or stir up drama. But Carl was a friend, and he had to say something. "Yeah, Carl, it was nothing. Just some random confrontation. Nothing I can't handle." Carl didn't let it go that easily. "Man, people are saying she was trying to pick a fight with you. I'm hearing from people that she came at you pretty hard. Is there anything I need to know? You okay?" the texts kept coming. Neighbors, acquaintances, even people from his construction business were asking about the altercation. He felt the eyes of the town on him, and it made his skin crawl. This was a small town, and in small towns, gossip spread faster than wildfire. What had started as an uncomfortable moment had somehow turned into the talk of the town. But it wasn't just the people who knew him that were asking about it, it was strangers, too. People who had no business knowing about the encounter were now pulling up to his job sites, eyeing him with a kind of judgment he hadn't felt before. Alex had always considered himself a quiet person. He didn't wear his beliefs on his sleeve, and he didn't engage in heated arguments with people, whether they agreed with him or not. But now, as the tension around him built, he started to feel like he was being forced into a corner. One morning, a week after the cafe incident, things came to a head. Alex had just finished a long day at work and was grabbing a quick bite at a different cafe on the outskirts of Greenfield. He'd hoped to avoid the rumors, to get some peace away from the prying eyes of the locals, but that was easier said than done. The door jingled as Alex walked in, and he was immediately met by the familiar faces of the usual crowd. This place wasn't as busy as the one downtown, and Alex thought it would be a perfect place to sit down, enjoy his meal, and escape the tension that had been building up since the confrontation. But as soon as he entered, he noticed something different. The woman with the mohawk was sitting at a table by the window, staring at him. She was alone, her eyes sharp, focused, almost as if she were waiting for him to make a move. Alex tried to ignore her. He was tired of the whole thing, but it seemed like it wasn't going to end anytime soon. He ordered his food, took a seat in the back of the room, and hoped the woman would leave him be. But she didn't. Instead, she got up, walked toward him, and stopped at his table. "You're avoiding me," she said, her tone more cold than it had been the last time. "Don't think I forgot about our little exchange at the cafe." Alex glanced around the room, but it seemed like no one else was paying attention. His hands clenched around his napkin, his stomach tightening. He didn't want this. Not here. Not now. "I'm not avoiding anyone," Alex said, keeping his voice even. "I don't want to get into this again." But the woman wasn't backing down. She leaned forward, her voice low but piercing. "You can't hide from what you are. You think wearing that hat makes you a patriot, but it doesn't. It makes you a part of the problem. You're part of the hate that's tearing this country apart." Alex's heart raced. He wasn't prepared for this, especially not in a place where he had hoped to find some peace. "You don't know me," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You don't know what I stand for." The woman's face twisted with a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "I don't need to know you. I know what your hat stands for. It stands for division. It stands for everything that's wrong with this world." Alex stood up then, the movement so quick and abrupt that it seemed to take both of them by surprise. He wasn't a big man, but in that moment, the weight of everything was on his shoulders, and his frustration boiled over. "You don't get it," he snapped. "You don't understand why I wear this hat. It's not about hate. It's about wanting something better for this country. But you wouldn't know anything about that because you're too busy judging people without even listening to them." For a moment, there was a tense silence between them, and Alex could feel the heat of his own words burning through him. He was tired of defending himself to someone who wasn't even interested in hearing his side of things. The woman's expression faltered for just a split second, as if Alex's words had struck a nerve. But it was brief, and it didn't last. "Yeah," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You keep telling yourself that. But it doesn't change the fact that you're part of the problem." With that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, the door swinging behind her with a harsh jingle. The room was quiet for a moment, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Alex stood there, his fists still clenched, his mind racing. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He hadn't asked for this. All he wanted was to live his life, to make a living, to enjoy his town. But somehow, this woman, this stranger, had made him feel like he was public enemy number one. The next few days were even worse. Word spread faster than wildfire. By the time Alex got to work the next day, a local reporter had shown up at his job site. She was polite, but persistent, asking him for his side of the story. Alex had never been one to court the spotlight, but now it seemed like he couldn't avoid it. The woman's actions had sparked something in the town, something that was no longer just about a political disagreement. It was personal now. The reporter, a woman named Sandra, asked the questions Alex didn't want to answer. She wanted to know why he wore the hat, how he felt about the confrontation, what his thoughts were on the woman's accusations. The more he tried to deflect, the more she pressed, and soon, Alex found himself sitting in front of a camera, his every word being scrutinized. "I don't want trouble," Alex said to the reporter, his voice quieter than it had been in the cafe. "I just want to be left alone. But people like her, they just want to make things worse." Sandra nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I understand, Alex, but the way you're being perceived." "I don't care about the perception," he interrupted, the frustration in his voice clear now. "I'm just a guy trying to get by. I didn't ask for this. But now it feels like I'm being dragged into something I don't even understand." As the days passed, the quiet town of Greenfield started to transform into something different. The tension that had been building between Alex and the woman with the mohawk grew. People in town weren't just talking about it anymore, they were taking sides. There were murmurs of protest, whispered arguments in the aisles of the local grocery store, and public debates at the barbershop. Greenfield, once a sleepy town where life moved at a steady pace, now felt on the edge of something much larger, something that no one could predict. As the week wore on, Alex began to realize that the confrontation wasn't just about him anymore. The town was changing, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He had no idea how much longer he could keep avoiding the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. The community he had once felt comfortable in was now divided. And no matter how hard he tried to keep things neutral, it seemed like everyone had picked a side. Alex was faced with a choice. He could retreat, let the conflict fade away and bury himself in his work, or he could stand up and face the consequences of his decision. Either way, he knew that his life in Greenfield would never be the same. The days that followed the reporter's interview left Alex in a strange limbo. It felt as though the world had tilted ever so slightly off its axis, and there was no way to put it back the way it had been. The weight of the town's expectations pressed on him from all sides. He had always been a man who kept to himself, his opinions, his beliefs, they were just that, his. But now, everything had shifted. People who had barely given him a second glance were now watching him closely, waiting for him to make his next move. It was no longer about the hat. It was about something deeper, something more personal. It was about who he was, what he stood for, and whether or not he would bend to the pressures of a town that, for all its charm, seemed to be turning against him. Everywhere he went, the atmosphere had changed. The usual hum of small-town life had been replaced with a charged silence. People seemed to whisper as he passed by, their eyes darting away quickly when they thought he wasn't looking. Even the local businesses, the ones he'd frequented for years, now felt distant, their owners offering forced smiles as though they didn't know whether to greet him or avoid him altogether. At first, it didn't bother Alex. He was used to being left alone, to keeping to the edges of social gatherings and watching from a distance. But now, the distance was growing, and he could feel the coldness seeping in. Alex tried to focus on his work, something that had always been his escape. There was comfort in the steady rhythm of construction, in the tangible results of his efforts. But no matter how hard he tried, the noise from the outside world crept in. His colleagues, who had once been his friends, now approached him with a sort of caution. They no longer spoke to him like they used to, as though the very air around him had become thick with unspoken judgments. It wasn't just the construction site. It was everywhere. His favorite diner, where he'd always gone for a quick breakfast, now felt like a battleground. The staff had grown distant, their smiles polite but strained. He noticed one morning that they had moved his usual table to a corner, out of sight of the other customers. It was a small thing, but it stung. It was as if they didn't want him to be too visible, as if his presence might disrupt the harmony of the place. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed subtle changes in the way people treated him. The whole town was shifting, and Alex was caught in the middle of it. The tipping point came on a Saturday morning, when he ran into Carla, a childhood friend who had always been one of the few people in Greenfield he could count on. Carla had been a constant in his life, someone he could confide in, someone who understood him without the need for explanation. But that day, as he walked into the grocery store and saw her at the produce section, something was different. She looked at him with a strange mixture of pity and hesitation, as if she didn't know how to approach him anymore. "Hey, Carla," Alex said, trying to break the tension. "How's everything?" Carla hesitated, glancing around nervously before meeting his eyes. I've been hearing things," she said softly, her voice low, as though she didn't want anyone else to hear. "About you. About what happened at the cafe. I just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay." Alex's heart sank. He had hoped Carla would be different, that she wouldn't buy into the gossip that had been swirling around him. But her tone, the way she spoke, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't concerned about his well-being, she was concerned about his reputation. And it wasn't just her. The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that the whole town had become infected by the same virus of judgment and division. "I'm fine," Alex said, forcing a smile. "Just trying to get through the day." Carla didn't seem convinced. I don't want you to be alone in this," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I know things are tough right now, but maybe you should just lay low for a while. Let things cool down." Alex felt his temper flare. Lay low? So I should just hide away and let everyone else decide what I should be, what I should believe? Carla looked taken aback. "No, that's not what I mean. I just think, maybe it's best to avoid confrontation. People around here, they're not as forgiving as they seem. You've seen how they've been acting. I just want you to be careful." But Alex had heard enough. He could feel the anger boiling up inside him, a kind of righteous fury he had never allowed himself to express. "You're telling me to back down, to let people walk all over me, just so I can fit into some idea of what they think I should be. Is that it?" Carla opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Alex turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the aisles, and in that moment, he felt a bitter mixture of sadness and frustration. It wasn't just the woman at the cafe. It was everything, the way the town had split down the middle, the way people he had known for years now saw him through a lens of suspicion and doubt. He wasn't just a man with a hat anymore. He was a symbol of something much larger, and the weight of it was suffocating. That night, as Alex sat in his small apartment, staring out the window at the lights of Greenfield twinkling in the distance, he felt the isolation closing in around him. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep his personal life separate from the world around him. But now, everything was intertwined, and he couldn't escape it. He wasn't just the guy who worked with his hands. He wasn't just the guy who loved this town. He was the guy who had caused a stir, the guy who had become a symbol of division. And no matter where he went, no matter how much he tried to keep things normal, the shadow of that moment in the cafe hung over him like a dark cloud. The next morning, as he walked into the diner again, hoping to get a quiet meal and just block out everything for a moment, he felt the eyes on him again. But this time, it wasn't just the usual awkward glances. People were staring. Not just glances, but full-on stares, as if they were waiting for him to say something, to do something. Alex tried to ignore it, to focus on his coffee, but the tension in the room was suffocating. He couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't just sit there and pretend like everything was fine. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for him to break, it happened. The woman with the mohawk entered. She was flanked by two men, their faces set in expressions of quiet defiance. She spotted Alex immediately, and a flash of recognition passed over her face. She didn't come to him, didn't confront him directly, but the way she looked at him told him everything he needed to know. She was still angry. Still determined to make him feel the weight of her judgment. But something in Alex snapped. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of her, or of what people thought. He wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. Not anymore. He stood up, walked over to her table, and stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle between them. The room seemed to hold its breath as everyone watched. "I'm not backing down," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I'm not going to let you or anyone else tell me what I should believe or how I should live. This isn't about the hat. This is about me being who I am, whether you like it or not." For a long moment, the woman just stared at him. Then, without a word, she stood up, grabbed her things, and walked out, her companions following silently behind her. The tension in the room broke, and the murmurs began almost immediately, but Alex didn't care anymore. It wasn't about them. It wasn't about the town. It was about him, taking control of his life and his narrative. As he sat back down at his table, the room slowly returned to its normal pace. The server brought his food over, a hesitant smile on her face. But for the first time in weeks, Alex didn't feel the weight of the stares. The world hadn't suddenly changed, but he had. He wasn't going to let the town's divisions define him. He was going to live his life on his terms, and if people couldn't accept that, then it was their problem, not his. But deep down, Alex knew this was only the beginning. The storm that had been brewing in Greenfield hadn't passed. It was still there, just waiting for the next spark to set it off. The following days felt like a drawn-out battle, each one taking more of a toll on Alex than the last. The incident at the diner was becoming a focal point, not just for the town but for the wider community. The quiet whispers of discontent and division had grown louder. Everywhere he went, there were eyes on him, eyes that had once been familiar, friendly, even trusting, now trained on him with judgment and scrutiny. The once calm and simple rhythms of Greenfield had become fractured. What had begun as an isolated confrontation was quickly snowballing into a larger societal debate, one that Alex had never expected to find himself at the center of. At work, the tension was palpable. The atmosphere on the construction site was noticeably different. Alex's colleagues, most of whom had been friendly and respectful for years, now regarded him with a mixture of wariness and uncertainty. Some would greet him with stiff nods, while others avoided his gaze altogether. The usual banter, the camaraderie that had once made the long hours bearable, had disappeared. It wasn't that anyone had openly challenged him, no one had outright called him out, but the weight of the silent judgment was enough to make every interaction feel like walking on eggshells. It was as though Alex had become a pariah, someone who needed to be handled carefully, lest the wrong words or actions ignite another firestorm. In moments of rare solitude, Alex found himself reflecting on how it had come to this. The confrontation with the woman at the diner, the way he had stood his ground, refusing to back down, felt like both a victory and a loss. A victory in the sense that he had finally spoken out, asserting himself and his right to believe what he wanted. But a loss because, in doing so, he had unleashed something far beyond his control. The town had become a powder keg, with people on either side of the issue, some willing to support him, others determined to tear him down. The once peaceful town he had known and loved had been irrevocably changed, its unity fractured in ways that felt impossible to repair. The hardest part for Alex was knowing that it wasn't just about him anymore. His decision to stand up for himself had set off a chain reaction that was affecting everyone around him. Friends were divided. Neighbors, who had once greeted him with warmth and familiarity, were now wary of even speaking to him. Carla, his longtime friend, had become distant. She would still wave when she saw him, but the warmth that had once marked her gestures had faded into a forced politeness. The small-town solidarity that had once been the heartbeat of Greenfield seemed to be crumbling, replaced by something far less forgiving. It wasn't just the personal relationships that were under strain. Greenfield's sense of community, its foundation, was beginning to show cracks. Local businesses were affected. The cafe, which had always been a gathering place for town folk, was now a battleground for political and ideological debates. The owner, who had once treated Alex like a regular, now avoided making eye contact. Even the weathered faces of the old-timers who sat at the counter had changed. They'd once greeted him with friendly grins and the occasional gruff compliment about his work. Now, their conversation seemed more subdued when he entered, as if unsure whether or not to acknowledge his presence. Alex wasn't blind to it. He could feel it in the air, the palpable shift in the town's dynamics. The small, tight-knit community had turned into something unrecognizable, a place where division thrived, and unity felt like a distant memory. One evening, Alex was at the hardware store, picking up supplies for a new project. The clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged man named Dave, who had always been a quiet, reliable presence in the store, suddenly broke the silence. "You still stand by what you did at the diner?" Dave asked, his voice low and guarded. Alex was taken aback by the question. Dave wasn't one to speak out of turn. The question, though not an accusation, carried with it an underlying tension that Alex couldn't ignore. "I stand by it," Alex said, trying to keep his tone even. "I'm not going to apologize for speaking my mind." Dave nodded slowly, his eyes flicking over to the shelves as if searching for something to distract him from the conversation. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was softer. "People are talking. People are angry. Some of them think you're in the wrong. Some of them think you're doing the right thing. But you've got to know, things around here, they won't be the same." Alex felt a sharp pang in his chest. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way they carried an unspoken weight. Dave wasn't warning him. He was mourning something lost, something irreparably damaged. "I know," Alex muttered. "I didn't ask for this. But I'm not gonna back down." Dave sighed, rubbing his forehead as if the very idea of this conflict weighed heavily on him. "It's not just about you, Alex. This town's got deep roots. People here are set in their ways. What happened, it's shaken something in everyone. Things won't just go back to normal." The words hung in the air between them, and Alex could feel a knot forming in his stomach. He knew what Dave meant. Normal wasn't an option anymore. Not after what had happened. And the realization settled into Alex's bones with a crushing finality. The town he had grown up in, the town he had always thought of as home, was lost to him. It wasn't just that people were upset with him. It was that they no longer knew how to see him, how to fit him into the community they had all built together. His identity, wrapped up in that hat, had become a symbol of something that divided more than it united. The days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere continued to grow thicker, more tense. It wasn't just that the town had split down the middle, it was that each side was now watching the other, ready to pounce on any misstep, any small indication that someone might be crossing lines. Alex had become a kind of test case, a microcosm of the larger issues that were sweeping across the country. And it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the choices people were making, about what they stood for, and whether or not they were willing to compromise or stand firm in their beliefs. But Alex wasn't compromising. Despite the pressure, despite the loneliness, he refused to back down. He couldn't. Not because he believed he was right, not because he thought his side was the only one worth listening to, but because he refused to let the town he had known so well force him into a corner. It wasn't about politics or ideologies anymore, it was about the simple act of standing his ground, of saying, "This is who I am, and I'm not going to apologize for it." And yet, despite his resolve, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irrevocably lost. The town he had loved so dearly was slipping through his fingers, and no matter how much he fought to hold on, it was fading away. The friendships, the connections, the sense of community, it was all crumbling, one painful step at a time. The pivotal moment came one evening when Alex decided to take a different route home, passing by the park where the local high school baseball team had just finished their game. He had always been a fan of the game, a casual observer who enjoyed the simplicity of it. But as he approached the field, something caught his eye. There, standing by the fence, was a group of teenagers, dressed in MAGA hats and shirts, talking loudly, their voices carrying over the fading light of the evening. Alex had never seen them before, but the sight of the group made his stomach twist. They were clearly a new presence in town, one that seemed to feed off the divisiveness that had been slowly creeping into Greenfield. As he walked past them, one of the boys, a tall, lanky figure with a cocky grin, spotted him. He raised his hand, a mocking salute. "Well, well, if it isn't Mr. Big Shot, the man who thinks he knows what's best for everyone," the boy called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Alex stopped in his tracks, feeling his blood boil. He had dealt with enough of this, hadn't he? Enough of people who thought they could provoke him, enough of the backhanded remarks and the undercurrents of hatred that seemed to swirl around him. But this time, something snapped. "Watch your mouth," Alex said, turning slowly to face the boy. "You have no idea what you're talking about." The boy smirked, clearly enjoying the confrontation. But something in Alex's stance, the fire in his eyes, made him pause. The game had changed. The boy took a step back, and for a moment, Alex stood there, breathing heavily, facing not just the teenager but the very embodiment of what Greenfield had become. In that moment, Alex realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future of this town, about whether or not it could heal, whether it could come back together. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stand by and let it all fall apart. Not without a fight. And maybe that fight wasn't one of anger or division. Maybe it was about something deeper, about finding common ground, even when it seemed impossible. As Alex walked away from the field, the weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure: the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Alex sat alone in his truck, parked by the edge of Greenfield Park, staring out at the darkening horizon. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. The weight of the past weeks pressed heavily on him, and despite the clarity he thought he had about his decision to stand his ground, he felt like a part of him was slipping away. The peaceful town that had once been home, the place where he'd grown up, now felt like a foreign land. Everything had changed. The familiar faces that had greeted him with a wave or a smile were now just ghosts of the past. It wasn't just the town that had shifted. It was him. He wasn't sure if he could ever be the same person again, not after everything that had happened. The diner incident had been the catalyst, the moment that turned his life upside down. But it wasn't just that one event that had caused the rift in his world. It was everything that followed. The weeks of uncomfortable silences, the whispers behind his back, the strained relationships. The once solid bonds he had with his friends, co-workers, and neighbors had been pulled apart by the invisible threads of ideology and politics. It felt like an unrelenting storm, tearing at the fabric of his life. Alex had tried to ignore the pressure, to push through it, but the tension in Greenfield was palpable. Every interaction felt loaded with meaning. A simple nod from a neighbor carried an unspoken judgment. A comment at work, a look from a friend, it all seemed tinged with the residue of the conflict that had erupted, forcing its way into every corner of his existence. It had become a cycle of awkwardness and resentment that he couldn't seem to escape, no matter how hard he tried. But the thing that hurt the most was the way it had affected his family. His wife, Leah, had been supportive at first. She had stood by him, offering comforting words and reassurance. But as the weeks wore on, even she had begun to feel the strain. They hadn't had the kind of closeness they once shared. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt forced, strained. There were silences between them that hadn't been there before, a growing distance that neither of them could bridge. Alex had tried to talk to her about it, to ask if she was feeling the same way, but she just smiled faintly and said, "It's nothing we can't get through." Yet, Alex could feel it. The tension in her voice. The tiredness in her eyes. She wasn't herself. She wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had always been his anchor. And in some ways, Alex wasn't sure he was the man he used to be, either. One evening, after a long day at work, Alex found himself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a half-empty coffee cup, the remnants of a long-forgotten conversation with Leah lingering in the air. She had tried to talk to him about the toll all of this was taking on her, but it hadn't gone well. Alex had gotten defensive, as he often did. He wasn't used to feeling so vulnerable, to having his choices questioned by the one person who knew him better than anyone else. "I don't know what you want me to say, Leah," he had snapped earlier. "I'm doing what I think is right. I'm standing up for what I believe in. I'm not going to apologize for that." Leah's eyes had hardened, and for a moment, Alex had seen the anger flash in them. It wasn't just about the diner anymore, wasn't just about the politics or the ideology, it was about the emotional toll it was taking on both of them. They had always been able to talk things through, to work through their differences. But now, their conversations were like mines, each one with the potential to explode, to trigger something deeper, something that neither of them wanted to face. She had walked away from him that night, leaving him in the kitchen, the silence between them thicker than the air itself. Alex had tried to shake it off. He knew that Leah wasn't the type to hold grudges. They'd been through worse things before, had survived difficult times together. But this was different. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was the unraveling of something deeper. And as the days went on, the gap between them seemed to widen. The tension was subtle, but it was there, pulling them further apart. Leah's distractedness, her moments of quiet frustration, it all pointed to something that Alex couldn't deny. The cracks were appearing, and he wasn't sure how to fix them. One morning, Alex decided to take a walk through town, something he hadn't done in weeks. The weight of everything seemed to press down on him, and he needed some space to think. As he wandered through the familiar streets, the sounds of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the empty silence of Greenfield. The town, once so lively, now felt eerily still, as if it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. He passed by the old general store, where he had bought his first baseball glove as a child. The same wooden sign hung above the door, faded with age. He paused for a moment, remembering the days when the store had been a gathering spot, a place where people shared stories and caught up on the news. Now, the place looked closed off, the windows dusty and uninviting. A faint memory stirred in Alex, of simpler days when life was less complicated, when he could walk down these streets without the weight of a town's expectations on his shoulders. As he continued down the block, he spotted a familiar face, Carla, his old friend from high school. She was sitting on a bench outside a small cafe, a cup of coffee in hand. Alex had always admired Carla's quiet strength. She was the kind of person who had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. But today, there was a tension in her posture, an unease that Alex couldn't ignore. He hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. "Hey, Carla," he said, trying to sound casual, though he could feel the weight of the conversation they needed to have hanging in the air. Carla looked up at him, her smile hesitant but genuine. "Alex," she said softly. "I didn't expect to see you around here." "I've been busy," he replied, glancing around the quiet town square. "How's everything going?" Carla shrugged, her eyes flitting away as if she were searching for the right words. You know. Same old. Same town. Same problems. Nothing ever really changes. Alex couldn't help but sense the underlying bitterness in her voice. It was the same feeling he had, this gnawing sense that things would never be the same again. That no matter how hard he tried to move forward, the past would always be there, lurking in the background. Carla, listen, Alex said, sitting down beside her. I need to ask you something. She raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What's up? He took a deep breath. Do you think I did the right thing? At the diner, I mean. Standing up for myself like I did? Carla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the ground for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. Alex could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for her answer. I don't know, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. I think you were just trying to stand up for yourself. But, Alex, it's not always that simple, is it? He nodded, though a part of him didn't want to hear it. I know, he muttered, his gaze falling to the pavement. But sometimes I feel like. I don't know. Like I've lost something. Like something's broken, and no matter what I do, I can't fix it. Carla reached out and placed a hand on his arm, offering a comfort that, for a brief moment, made Alex feel like things might be okay. I know it's hard, she said, her eyes kind. But you've got to ask yourself what matters. You can't fix everything, Alex. You can't make everyone happy. You have to decide what you're willing to live with, and what you're willing to lose. Her words hit him harder than he expected, and for the first time in weeks, Alex felt like someone truly understood what he was going through. But even as the weight of her words settled into him, he knew that there was no easy answer, no simple way to repair what had been broken. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. As the day stretched on and the sun dipped lower in the sky, Alex felt a sense of resolution begin to form in his chest. Things might never be the same again, and that scared him more than anything. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Maybe it was time to embrace the change, to stop fighting the inevitable, and to start rebuilding, not just his relationships, but himself. The day dawned with a quiet heaviness that settled over Greenfield like a blanket. Alex had barely slept the night before, his thoughts a whirlwind of everything he had lost and everything that still lay ahead. His conversation with Carla had been a catalyst, but it had also left him with more questions than answers. What was the right thing to do now? Could things ever return to how they had been before the diner incident? Or was this a moment of reckoning, a new chapter in a life that had irrevocably changed? The morning sun broke through the trees, casting long shadows over the streets of Greenfield. Alex stepped outside his front door, the cool air biting at his skin. The silence of the neighborhood felt strange now. It wasn't the usual hum of activity that greeted him, cars pulling out of driveways, children running to school, people chatting on their front porches. No, now it was as if the town itself had withdrawn into itself, unsure of how to move forward after the events of the last month. He had been walking for almost an hour when he arrived at the diner. The familiar bell over the door jingled softly as he stepped inside. It was early, and the place was nearly empty, save for a few regulars nursing their coffee cups at the counter. As he walked toward the booth in the corner, the usual mix of smells hit him, the scent of fresh brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint tang of syrup. It was strange to be here again, and yet, it felt necessary. This place, despite everything, had been a part of his life for so long. And maybe, just maybe, it was where he needed to start healing. As he sat down, his eyes scanned the room. The waitress who had served him that day, Lori, was busy wiping down the counter, her eyes avoiding his gaze. It wasn't that she hated him, but there was a tension there, an unspoken animosity that still lingered. Alex felt it, but he couldn't blame her. She had been caught in the middle of a situation that had escalated beyond anyone's control. It wasn't just about the diner or the MAGA hat anymore. It had become a symbol of the deeper divisions that had been festering in the town for years. "Hey, Alex," Lori said, walking over to his booth. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but there was an edge to it that told him she wasn't ready to forget what had happened. "What can I get you today?" Alex hesitated, not sure what to say. The normal routine of ordering a cup of coffee and maybe a stack of pancakes seemed irrelevant now, trivial in the face of everything that had happened. "Just coffee for now," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Thanks, Lori." Lori nodded and walked away without another word, her movements a little stiff. As Alex sat there, waiting for his coffee, he couldn't help but think back to the first time he had set foot in this diner. He was just a kid then, coming in with his parents for a Sunday breakfast after church. Back then, the world had felt so much simpler. No one had ever questioned what you wore or who you supported. People came together over a meal, shared stories, and went on their way. That's how things used to be, and Alex couldn't help but wonder if they would ever return to that. The bell over the door jingled again, and Alex looked up to see a man walking in. He was tall, with a broad build and a weathered face, someone who looked like he had spent years on the road. His eyes met Alex's for a split second, and Alex immediately recognized him. It was Jeff, a longtime acquaintance from town. Jeff had been one of the first to reach out to Alex after the diner incident, offering words of support. But even with his friendly demeanor, there was a distance between them now, a space that neither of them knew how to bridge. Jeff took a seat at the counter, nodding at Lori as she approached him. They exchanged pleasantries, but it was clear to Alex that something had shifted between them. He could feel the weight of the past month hanging over the diner, like a cloud that refused to disperse. Jeff had been one of the people who had defended Alex during the confrontation, but he had also been one of the first to retreat when the tensions in town had escalated. Alex didn't blame him, but the disconnection still stung. As the minutes ticked by, Alex's mind wandered to Leah. He hadn't seen her much in the past few days. She had been working late, coming home exhausted, only to retreat into herself the moment the door closed behind her. It wasn't that she didn't care, but the pressure of everything that had happened had taken its toll on both of them. Alex couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to question their life together, their future. He didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to repair the damage that had been done. His thoughts were interrupted by Lori, who returned with a steaming cup of coffee. She set it down in front of him without saying a word, her eyes still avoiding his. Alex took a sip, the warmth of the liquid offering a small comfort, but it didn't last long. He set the cup down and looked up at her, trying to find the right words. "Lori," he said softly, "I know things got out of hand. But I just want you to know I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to be confrontational." Lori paused, her gaze flickering over him for a moment before she spoke. "I know you didn't mean to cause trouble, Alex," she said quietly. "But that day, it was more than just the hat. It wasn't just about you wearing it. It was about everything that's been building up in this town. The divisions, the arguments, the way people have started seeing each other as enemies. That's what really hurt. It wasn't just a hat. It was a symbol of all the things that have been festering under the surface for so long." Alex felt a pang in his chest as Lori's words hit home. He had known, deep down, that it wasn't just about the hat, that it was bigger than that. The diner had been a microcosm of the larger issues that had been dividing the town and the country. It was about identity, belief, and the way people viewed each other. It was about how something as simple as a piece of clothing could become a flashpoint for everything that had gone wrong. "I get it," Alex said quietly. "I never wanted to be a symbol of division. I didn't know what else to do." Lori nodded, her eyes softening slightly. "I know you didn't, Alex. But sometimes doing nothing is the hardest thing. And sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy. Alex sat there for a moment, processing her words. They weren't a solution, but they were a step toward understanding. He didn't know if things would ever go back to the way they had been, but maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new to emerge from the ashes of the old. As he stood to leave, Alex glanced at Jeff one last time. The man caught his gaze, and for the first time in weeks, they shared a brief, knowing look. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, the town could heal, that things could be different, if only they were willing to try. When Alex left the diner, the morning sun had risen higher, casting a warm glow over the streets of Greenfield. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but Alex felt a flicker of hope that had been missing for so long. He wasn't sure how things would turn out. He didn't have all the answers. But he knew one thing for sure: the past few weeks had changed him. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop holding on to what had been, and start looking toward what could be. As Alex made his way back home, his mind turned to Leah. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he was determined to find out. He had made mistakes. He had lost his way. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to make things right. And that thought, that small glimmer of possibility, was enough to keep him moving forward. Greenfield had been through a lot. The town, the people, all of them had been tested. But Alex was starting to believe that even the deepest scars could heal, given time and the right intentions. Maybe it wasn't too late for anyone to find their way back. Maybe it wasn't too late for him.